Hi, welcome to the Elle Russ Show, where I deliver content intended to inspire, educate, and motivate. Engage with me online at elleruss.com and on social media. Enjoy the show. Today, my guest is Celeste Headlee. She's an award-winning journalist, professional speaker, and author. She's an expert in conversation and human nature, and she often provides insight on what is good for all humans and what is bad for us, focusing the best research in neuro and social science to increase understanding of how we relate with one another and how we can work together in beneficial ways. She's a regular guest host on NPR and American Public Media, a highly sought-after consultant. I'm sure you've seen her on many news shows and talk shows and programs over the years, and we're going to be talking about her latest book today, Speaking of Race. It's going to be released November 2nd. I would definitely pre-order a copy of it. It's an incredible book. Speaking of Race, Why Everybody Needs to Talk About Racism and How to Do It. Her other books include We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter, and Do Nothing, How to Break Away from Overworking, Overdoing, and Underliving. Visit CelesteHeadlee.com for more information about her, or visit our show notes for a more in-depth bio. Hey, Celeste, welcome to the show. So glad to meet you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, I think. I'm keeping my head above water like everybody else.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed your book, Speaking of Race, that I just read, and it's out November. Everybody should get a copy of this. I think I felt like I was a better human being after reading it. And it also brought up a lot of stuff in my personal life, some things I can identify with a little bit, which is what you've identified with. So let's just talk to start off a little bit about sort of, where you're from, because you have described yourself as a light-skinned Black Jew, and your grandparents had to get married in Mexico because marriage between a Black man and a Jewish woman was illegal in California then, and there was a lot of violence associated with that. So let's just talk about, growing up with this strange identity.
Yeah, I think I'm quite light-skinned, which I have to be open about and say that was, if not openly intentional and conscious on my family's part. That's part of the racist system we live in, right? That the idea that if you're lighter skinned, you're not only more attractive, but more successful and credible is probably what led to where we are today. So that said, I grew up, my grandparents lived in a neighborhood of Los Angeles, which was basically one of the very first Black middle-class neighborhoods there, right near the corner of Pico and Crenshaw. And I grew up with them mostly. When they got married, a lot of the white family members, pretty much all of them, ran for the hills. And you see that happening in a lot of mixed race families, especially in the past, is that when someone of color marries somebody who's white, oftentimes the white family wants nothing to do with it. So you end up getting raised by people of color, which in my case, I think is awesome. And I also, the other thing about it is that I also grew up in a largely white neighborhood where my mother lived. My grandparents lived in a Black neighborhood. My mother lived in a white neighborhood in Mission Viejo, California. So not only did I get to see sort of the difference in these two communities, but I was also the second darkest kid at my school. Mm-hmm. And I grew up there was never a thought in my head that I was white, ever, because as soon as people know that you're part Black, that's it, you're Black.
Yep.
So that's how I grew up. I didn't have my racial identity really questioned, or anybody say, wow, you shouldn't call yourself Black, until I was in college.
Yeah, that is so interesting how some people claim you have a right or not a right
exactly
to own a certain part of your heritage. This is a really juicy topic. So let's just start off with the bummer at the beginning of the book, which is that we're all racist, even if we don't think we are. We've got some issues. and part of that is, you talk about the casual racism comments and how, if we don't exclude people from these categories, for example, somehow we're not considered racist, but it doesn't mean you have to exclude a whole community in order to have these quips. One of my favorite movies on this is a 1946 movie called Gentleman's Agreement. It won the Oscar.
Yeah.
It's like a movie every Jew should see, but I think every person should see, because what they really nailed, I was so impressed with the writers back then, because Jews are, at least how they were portraying the film, white, right? Uh, they really navigated the subtleties of the anti-Semitism that was going on. And the premise of that movie is that Gregory Peck wants to write a story about anti-Semitism. He goes to New York. He's like, what can be said about it that hasn't already been said? So he just decides to change his last name to a Jewish name and then just reaps the consequences of these subtleties. And that whole gentleman's agreement comes from these sort of fancy resorts and things like that, where they had a gentleman's agreement not to let Jews in. This was the most enlightening movie for me because in my family, I'm half Jewish and I'm also very blonde, blue-eyed, Scandinavian looking. And like you mentioned in your book, unfortunately, when you're in sort of a precarious or not obvious race or class of people, people say shit around you.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do all the time. And when I was younger, and I mean in elementary school, even in high school, sometimes people would say racist things, and I would keep my mouth shut because I didn't. You don't want to make people feel bad. You don't want to start a fight. There's also a lot of punishment for people who point out racist or anti-Semitic comments. There's the punishment of, he was just joking. You're being too sensitive. Essentially, why does it all have to be about race? What's wrong with you? And as a young person, I didn't want to take that on. I do now. And that's not to say that's not a value judgment. If somebody is an adult right now and they don't want to take that on, that is okay. The problem is not you. It's the racist and sexist society in which we live in. But I have decided since then to say something every time. It's exhausting. I don't know how it is for you. It can be exhausting.
It is exhausting. Well, you get so many weird comments like, oh, I'm Jewish. Oh, you don't look Jewish. So that's a classic.
God.
And then, or they just say really fucked up stereotypical stuff about Jews in front of you. And then you're like, hey, bro, I'm Jewish. And then they're doing the backtrack move. And it's really an awkward, exhausting kind of situation. And also, too, this note of, and I'm not sure how you feel about this, given your heritage and the way that you look, et cetera, but this really divided my family because I had blonde Jew grandparents who were made fun of for being blonde Jews when they were younger, and they could quote pass, right? This idea. Yeah. And my grandmother wanted to be the first female Supreme Court justice. She was on her way. She was the youngest female attorney in the state of Illinois. She helped women get on juries. And, if I look back at her life then, I'm like, I might have pulled the same move. There was so much anti-Semitism in the 30s and 40s. And I might have also thought, I don't know if I can get ahead, right? Without this. And, she flew down and marched with Martin Luther King. And I grew up that way, thankfully, but it divided my family because she still had that old school way of thinking of like, I don't want anyone to know that I'm Jewish so they don't judge me or discriminate against me. So I'm going to lock out the whole other side of the family that looks Jewish, practices Judaism. I don't want to be associated. And so that was a bad riff in our family. It's almost like you become racist against your own kind to avoid the racism coming towards you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and this brings us back to sort of where you started, which is this ugly truth that we're all racist. And there's never any implication that some people aren't worse than others. Of course, some people are worse than others. But the fact of the matter is that we are swimming in racist waters. And so all of us, if you take the implicit association test that Harvard offers, the IIT test, it's free. There's lots of them to choose from. Take one. You discover that women are sexist, and people of color are racist, and old people are ageist, and sometimes disabled people are ableist. Like this is these are the horrible discriminatory waters in which we swim, and it bleeds into our subconscious. One of the things that I talk about in the book is the very famous doll test that two African American psychologists used, and it was part of the underpinnings for the desegregation of education, Brown versus Board of Education decision in the Supreme Court. And essentially they brought in a bunch of black kids and they showed them two dolls, one black, one white. And they would ask things like, which one's prettier? Which one's nicer? Which one is a better doll? And these black kids would point to the white doll. Yeah. And they would say, okay, which one looks like you? And there's this horrible moment when that when you read through these tests where this little black boy points, they say, which one looks like you? He points to the black doll and he says, that one, that's a nigger like me.
Ugh.
And again, the question I ask in the book is that kid racist? Yeah. Yes. He has absorbed these racist assumptions about his own self. Does that make him as bad as David Duke? Of course not. But it does mean that these unfair, unjust assumptions and stereotypes about other people are living inside our subconsciouses, and we have to come to grips with that.
Well, and one of your books, how to have a conversation, or
Yeah.
sorry, how we need
to talk, yeah.
how to have conversations that matter. Let's get into that a little bit. So I love what you said here. You said being an anti-racist is not a status you achieve, but a skill you must constantly practice. Where can we start with this?
So, I mean, and this does take us back, as you say, to we need to talk, because the best way is to listen to other people's experiences. One of the biggest mistakes people make is privilege explaining. And the most common version of this is mansplaining, where men will start explaining very simple things to you that you know about, or, I'm a journalist and men will start explaining media to me.
Oh my gosh.
But there's all kinds of privilege explaining, right? There's cisgendered people explaining gender identity to trans folk. There's straight people explaining gay issues to gay LGBTQ folk. There's white people explaining to people of color what they should be upset about and how it's best to fight against racism. So the best thing to do is to start listening to other people's experience, really listening to it, and trying to stop that voice in your head, which is constantly figuring out what you disagree with, what you think is wrong. That's what's known as evaluative listening. I want you instead to engage in truly transformative listening. Transformative listening is where you are listening simply to understand better what someone's saying, and it's the only type of listening in which there's a possibility that you could change as a result of what you hear.
And that increases empathy, as you say.
Absolutely.
When we hear other people's stories and journeys of how it was for them, that's better than throwing, like you mentioned, statistics into a conversation or these other things. That's not personal, is it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not convincing. We just don't have any evidence that telling somebody statistics, giving them the facts, changes their mind the smallest bit. That just makes them more determined to argue against you. But what you can't argue, if I tell you about my own experiences, what are you going to say? Right? You're going to tell me I'm wrong about what happened to me? I mean, there are some people who do that, but that's much more likely to touch somebody's heart. And just to take this one step further, because some of this also applies to things like misogyny.
Mm-hmm.
We have this inherent mistrust of people, like men, for example, who say, I understand this better now because I have daughters. And we think, well, that's ridiculous. You should understand sexism just in general, not just because you have daughters. But that's just not how the human mind works.
Right. Until it's personal to you, right? No one really cares about rheumatoid arthritis until it hits you or your family. And that's why now you're doing a 10-mile walk on it, or et cetera.
Yeah, and the way to get past that sort of daughter effect is if you can get that personal experience and understand better just by doing this exercise of true transformative listening.
It's interesting on the subject of misogyny there. It just reminds me of something I mentioned in my second book, Confident as Fuck, where I'm talking about how to deal with children. And it's interesting because, what I'm sort of imploring to the reader is, hey, can we stop only complimenting little girls on how pretty and cute they are and their dresses? It's important to point out things that boys are appreciated for, which is like, that's so smart, or what a really, that's a really interesting connection. So I try to implore parents and people to, on the point, children are making really great observations. They may be basic to us, but as they're learning and going along, why aren't we complimenting little girls on that? Like, oh, you're so kind, or what a smart thing. Yes, you're right about that. You connected those two, the things that have to do with the brain and other sort, and yes, we're so used to just being, you're so cute. What a pretty bow. And yes, little girls love that. But again, it's on that kind of same note. I want to jump into, you portrayed an interesting conversation that Derek Black, who was the godson of David Duke, and who was also the son of Don Black, who founded a neo-Nazi online forum. And you talked about his college experience. And I thought it was interesting because he went to dinner with, a Jew and a Muslim and a bunch of different people. And it was interesting that he said he was eventually challenged by his future girlfriend, who asked him some interesting questions. I thought these were interesting. Can you defend why you believe this? What are the facts behind it? And what is your moral justification for it? That is so much more of a productive conversation and a line of questioning than like, what kind of asshole are you? Who do you think you are? There's people out there, right? There's sort of anger, judgment. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is there is a real Jewish tradition of questioning.
Yes.
And it is not angry. I think I forget I forget who said it, but there's to be Jewish is to ask questions, and pardon me that I don't remember who originally said that. It's just said by so many people. But Jews have this tradition of questioning the Torah, of even questioning their very foundational beliefs, and they ask things like that. According to whom? What's your source? What are the implications of that? What is the morality behind that? And those seem to be the kind of questions she was asking. More importantly, she was asking questions, not lecturing him. She believed completely differently than he did. She was offended by his beliefs. He describes that people at his college campus were afraid of him, and rightly so. Afraid that he might be violent, afraid of what he might do to people that he hated. And she questioned him and forced him to defend his own beliefs. That wasn't the only thing that changed his mind, of course. As you alluded to, that while this was going on and she was asking him these tough questions, a Jewish student was inviting him for Shabbat dinner every Friday and made the rule to everyone who was there that they were not to bring up his beliefs.
Yes, and I love that because then that makes us all connect on everything else as humans.
Yeah, and according to Derek, the thought behind that was he felt that as the Jewish student felt that as Derek got to know these other people, that in and of itself would be a challenge to his beliefs.
Right. Just being there. Yeah.
Yeah. Just realizing that they are not stereotypes, that the things he believes about Jews in general, Black people in general, Muslims don't hold true for individuals.
There's a study on metacognition that you mentioned where participants were sort of polled on their political beliefs first and then presented pictures about like which one contained the most polka dots. And I found this to be interesting. Can you tell us about this? Because it really, what it does is the conclusion is that it really explains why some are just not persuaded by evidence that disproves their beliefs rather than change their opinion. They simply just decide not to believe the evidence. So I would love you to just talk about that one for a minute.
Yeah, they would quiz people and ask them to, just quiz to decide where they were on the political spectrum, right? There's the extreme ends of either liberal or conservative, and then most of us are somewhere in the middle. And then they would do these tests, and they would give them show them a piece of paper that had a whole bunch of polka dots on it, and they'd say, guess how many dots are on there. They didn't have the time to count them, right? So they would just tell them to guess. And then they would explain whether they were right or wrong. Like, there's no wiggle room here.
Right. Facts are facts when it comes to polka dots.
There's a number of polka dots on the page. But the people who were at the extreme ends, both the extreme right and the extreme left, still maintained confidence in their original guess, even if it was wrong. Mm-hmm. They could not accept that they might have been wrong. And it's part of this, we don't, neurologists and scientists don't entirely know how this works. But it seems to be that those who have extreme political beliefs really have a tough time questioning themselves, or doubting their own opinions, or thinking again, having their minds change. They become just absolutely entrenched.
So those are the tougher nuts to crack out there, obviously, in terms of this conversation. And I want to get into having this conversation a little bit more. So I love so many things you brought up in this book. It's so good, but I love that you brought up the core concept in the world of like improvisation, the whole yes and.
Yeah.
So for people not listening, when you're doing improv and it's made up on the spot and it's basically playing a game, and it's not necessarily trying to be funny, but in that process, so if someone comes on stage and they're like, hello, brother, or whatever, which would be a little bit ridiculous for an improviser to do, but let's say they did that. And then you're the other improviser on stage. You're like, you're not my brother. Up, the whole thing's killed. So you always yes and. You're like, yes, and how's mother today or whatever. You just go yes and everything. So tell us how that can be applicable in conversation, and also how to respect and convey respect. Because, you mentioned, look, you're a journalist. You are often in a position of preparing to interview people. You don't like their views. You find them problematic. That's going to be a tough position to be in. So let's talk about, or maybe give an example of how we can approach this with someone that might be, again, like on the extreme where they're the polka dot kind of person.
So the yes and thing, it's funny because I do the yes and exercise a lot in my workshops, and everyone, when I'm explaining it, it looks at me very smugly. Nobody thinks this is going to be difficult. And it ends up being difficult for over half of the people in every workshop I've done. They so struggle to not say yes, but like it's really difficult for them to keep saying yes and simply build off of what they heard instead of refuting it. Like they can maybe do it the first time or the second time, and then that's it. They fall into their natural pattern of correcting, refuting. We are all so much in the habit of listening to someone only up to the point when we hear something that we either disagree with or want to correct or offer unsolicited advice on. And then we stop listening because we're waiting to spread our wisdom and tell the other person the truth, right? So give this exercise a try. It is the simplest exercise in the world. Just try it out. In terms of showing respect to people, it does build off that exercise, because as a reporter, you're trying to get information out of them, and you're trying to get that information as clear and coherent as possible. So, for example, after the murder of the Black parishioners, there was a big, you may remember, there was a big debate over the Confederate flag. And this is something that we covered heavily on my talk show that was coming out of Atlanta. And I'm sure people know that in Georgia, the debate over the Confederate flag is quite contentious. And so I had to have conversations with all kinds of people with whom I didn't agree. The president of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, all kinds of them.
Ouch.
And I would say, listen, I am the great granddaughter of slaves. Okay. My family was owned on a plantation not far from Atlanta. I feel like you can understand that I have strong opinions about the Confederate flag, but I'm going to be fair. And if I'm not, tell me. If I say something you think is unfair or inaccurate, then tell me. I would say that before every single show. That was not just for the benefit of the people I was interviewing. It was for the audience as well.
That's a very incredibly diplomatic way to approach that. I admire that.
Yeah, I think that to a certain extent, transparency is the answer. It's the refutation of this myth about objectivity. None of us are objective, but we can be transparent. I have to do interviews sometimes with anti-vaxxers with whom I could not disagree more. Number one, I limit my questions. I do not ask the same questions of an anti-vaxxer as I do of an epidemiologist or a medical doctor. I'm going to ask them about their area of expertise, what they feel, what they believe, what they've been through. What do you know? What are the limits of your knowledge? And then I'm just going to be fair. I don't bring them there to undermine them or humiliate them. Every single person, no matter who they are, deserves some human dignity. I mean, we even show human dignity to in general to people who've taken another life.
Yep.
Right? That's a concept in our court system, that they at least deserve the minimum of human dignity and respect. They are a human being. And that's what I try to show to other people as well. It's alarming how many people don't agree with that, by the way. Don't agree that, for example, they should, if they're speaking to someone who supported Trump, or on the other side, if they're speaking to someone who voted for Bernie or whatever, that they truly believe that they're allowed to say whatever they want to that other person. Do not believe in mutual respect. It's
right. It's almost they become the enemy and you just talk down to them as if they're, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. I mean, that's just absolutely ridiculous. One of the things I wanted to bring up in this book was the study of rhetoric, which for a very long time, for thousands of years, was a major area of study and scholarship among human beings. But in rhetoric, there are ethics, right? There are, you have to think about the ethics of your conversation or your debate. You have to think about your obligation to this other human being. You have to question yourself of how bad does someone have to be before it's not even ethical for me to engage them in conversation. And I'm not going to tell anybody what those answers should be for them, but I want people to start thinking about that. And the other thing I want them to start thinking about is consent. At what point has someone either explicitly or implicitly given consent to a conversation about race?
Detail that a little bit more. And give us an example. What do you mean that in real life? We can look at that.
So, for example, if it can go either way. If a white person says something that's a microaggression, they ask to touch your hair. They ask if a black person is good at basketball. Do we consider that to be consent to a conversation about how racist that is? Is that consent?
Meaning, if someone makes a comment like that, is that consent enough for me to go, hey, bro, kind of thing? Is that what you mean? To bring it up?
I mean, I think it's okay to point out, hey, I don't agree with that. What did you just say? Blah, 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 blah. I'm talking about the longer conversations, sometimes tirades and lectures that people give on both sides, by the way. So if a black person mentions race during the meeting, is that consent for you to start lecturing that person about their oversensitivity or bringing up other issues in which you felt that things weren't a joke? We're talking about engaging someone in conversation, not commenting back, right? Commenting back is one thing. I'm talking about engaging them in a longer conversation, which I think requires consent.
In what way? Meaning asking the person like, hey, I'd like to have a conversation with you about this. Are you open to it? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah. So for example, if I hear someone using a microaggression, that's the most common thing that I experience. I will say, wait, what? Because I think one of the best things you can do is force them to repeat what they just said. Sometimes that's enough. But I will always, point out what that they've just said is objectionable and inappropriate. And I will always say, why? On a personal level. I don't say, hey, don't make comments about Asians because the Asians in the room might be upset. I will say, I'm upset by that, and here's why. But in order for that to go any further, I have to my mind, I have to ask, can we talk about where that comes from? Or would you mind explaining to me what was behind that remark? I will then ask a question rather than just keep going and giving them all my thoughts and assumptions about what they were thinking or why they said what they said.
I think a lot of times, and it's especially difficult if someone's out there and has a family member that's constantly making racial slurs, etc. And I think a lot of people just don't bother even having the conversation because they figure it's past the point of no return. And you do mention, you're like, hey, don't it's sort of how I mentioned in my book, when I talk about confidence and speaking up, I'm like, not at the sacrifice of your getting punched in the face, right? There are times when you're going to speak up or not speak up. I'm not sure I would proudly proclaim I'm half Jewish if I'm in the middle of some anti-Semitic thing going on, or some in the middle of some area of the country where I could be in danger. I would probably lie or get the hell out of there. But so it's tough. I think a lot of people think people are past the point of no return. It's not worth it. They're just who they are. How do people out there who've got a family member that continues on this train, how can we open up a conversation, not necessarily even to change their mind, maybe that, but then also, how about just maybe having them avoid those words or things? That's a little bit patching a symptom, right? But can we talk about that with family members and how to open up this conversation? Or even if we should, do we just let it go? They're too old. They're never going to change their ways. We still want them to see the grandkids or whatever these excuses are.
Yeah. So, first of all, if it's your family member, you are better placed to have an impact on their behavior than pretty much anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. By not speaking up, you're kind of really saying, I have no obligation or responsibility to the people of color. And I'm assuming this is a white person who's making racial statements, because that's a very, very common scenario.
Yes, that's what
what kind of obligation or responsibility do you have to all the people of color that this relative is going out and abusing and harassing and subjecting to that kind of speech? I'm not saying
right. And even if they're not, even if they keep it to themselves around those people, it's still being expressed. It's filters in.
It's going to seep out.
Yep.
Yeah. So that's number one. Because we know that people are much more likely to change their behavior because of some pressure from a family member and someone they're close to, someone who looks like them and has a similar background, than by pretty much everybody else. That's number one. Number two is, don't try to change their mind. Don't, because you won't. Mm-hmm. You can't change their mind. But what you can do is say, hey, this hurts me when you say that. That really bothers me. And I know that you're not the kind of person that wants to hurt my feelings every time I see you. So can you not say this? And always put it in the personal, what this is doing to you, how you feel. When you try to put it into some vague terms of you're hurting Black people, if this person's racist, they don't give a flying.
Yep.
But also, you always need to talk about yourself and not other people. Talk about your own experience. So tell them, you know what? When you say those things, it hurts my feelings. It bothers me. And I have trouble letting it go. I have trouble talking to you when those things come out of your mouth. Can you, for my sake, please not say whatever that was you just said? Can I explain to you why this bothers me? Can we talk about why this is hurting my feelings? You can have those kind of conversations. Now, you might have to do this over and over and over and over again. It might be the kind of situation in which, if they want to see you, or if you have children and they want to see young kids, which they often do, you can say, hey, listen, every single time you say something like that, I'm leaving.
Yeah. And don't say it around my kids. And if you do, I'm out. Absolutely. You have to train these people. And that's with anything that comes out of people's mouth. It doesn't even have to be racism. It could be just something that, whatever they're lamenting about, that's ridiculous. I had a family member who kind of would constantly judge overweight people and things like that. And I would be like, oh my God, I wrote a book on hypothyroidism. I was uncontrollably fat there for a while, which gave me an incredible empathy towards people, right? It's not always not everyone brings it upon them, right? Yeah. Knowingly. And so when I had a situation where I couldn't lose weight, I was hypothyroid, I was having the struggle, I felt incredible empathy for people who were overweight, or possibly, again, struggling with something that they did not know of, even that was affecting their metabolic health. And so I kept having to say to the person, hey, enough. And then they'd bring it. I go, hey, what did I say? What did I say about, if you're going to be around me, you're not going to make comments about fat people or how much people are eating out there, or look at that person, this is so disgusting. I won't stand. And it took like a lot of times. It does. I just kept I repeated the same thing like a child. Like I said, no, and finally it kind of worked. I think they shut up. They realized that I trained them out of it in a way.
Yeah. And if you've ever, in any way been a caretaker of kids, you know that that's sometimes how it happens, that it can be over time that these changes make, but you also know that you have to be consistent. Don't say you're going to leave if they say something and
That's
then
right.
don't leave.
Yeah, or don't say you're going to do something and not do it. That's also
Right.
another terrible thing. Kids don't have abstract thoughts. You can't be like, oh, maybe we'll go to Disneyland someday. They hear, when are we going? It's planned. Like,
Exactly.
right. So that's sort of on that same
If
note.
you say I'm leaving this Thanksgiving dinner, if you say X, Y, and Z, and X, Y, and Z is said, then you get up and you go. You have to follow through on that. It's funny how many things we think are relevant only to kids learning, and not that that's just how humans learn. But this is one of those ways in which that's not how kids learn. That's how human beings learn, is consistency. So follow through.
Right. It was interesting you brought up black hair. This was something I had to learn because so I have curly hair, and when it's like ultra curly and then it's, best having a best hair day, there are times when kids and people ask me like, can I touch your hair? And I totally, even though I'm like, yeah, sure, I don't have an issue with that. And then my, one of my best friends who's black was like, hey, don't ever touch a black girl's hair. And I went down this whole rabbit hole where I watched that whole Netflix series about the woman, the first, yeah. And I went through this whole, and by the way, I honestly, I can't even, it blew my mind. Like I had no idea this struggle. I had no idea what it takes to even maintain the story, the history. I had no idea. I felt so enlightened after that. But I did even after learning that one time, I made a mistake. There was a girl with beautiful braids. I was at a party and I just walked right up and touched her hair. And then afterwards, I was like, oh my God, I just felt so
Yeah.
terrible about it. And I said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And then I was just like, what an asshole. My friend already told me about this. And here I am as a natural thing, just reaching towards this cool head of hair that I was like, how cool. And again, just because it doesn't bother me, right? I just didn't even know the history behind it.
Yeah.
And until I learned it, and honestly, I felt so enlightened by it. I'm so glad I took the time to watch that series. I learned something about history I didn't know. I didn't know about that woman and her incredible contributions. And so, in a way, that one little thing led me down a rabbit hole for greater understanding and also to correct mistakes I might have made in the past by touching my girl's hair, and also to prevent myself from doing something like that in the future.
Yeah, and I have a whole chapter in the book about making mistakes.
Yes, yes. That's why I was kind of bringing it up because what do
Yeah.
we do? We make some
What
mistakes.
what do you do? I think the first line of it is something like there are two kinds of people: those who have said the wrong thing about race and those who will. Um, because I don't care what your ethnicity is. Look, I'm Black, Jewish, very, very small part Native American from my great grandmother's side. Um, and I am going to say the wrong thing, right? And I have said the wrong thing. And I try to, in the book, actually fess up to some of the things that I've said that were racist, just so people can understand, A, we need to take the terror out of screwing up, but we also need to use those screw ups as a chance to educate ourselves, just as you did. You will say the wrong thing. Don't pretend that you didn't. Don't laugh it off and pretend that it was a joke. Don't
Mhm.
try and displace that bad feeling that you have by saying the other person was overly sensitive. Just lean into it. Say, oh my gosh, I feel horrible. That was awful. What can I do? I'm so sorry. What can I do to make this better? And then educate yourself. One thing I don't want people to feel to do is to then ask this person whom they have offended or possibly damaged to explain to them why it's wrong. Don't add insult to injury by forcing them to be your educator and detail why that mistake was wrong. You can ask, but I think it's better to just say, I'm going to educate myself. I'm so sorry. And then do educate yourself.
Yeah, I had an incident not too long ago, and it was with a friend who, again, I don't consider racist at all. He's Jewish, but not that Jews can't be racist, but he's definitely not. And we were talking about all of the awful racist things happening in our country. And he was like, what, aside from donating to political campaigns, like, I'm wondering what I can do. And I said, well, you can always, if you're in a position of hiring or something like that, or giving anyone an opportunity in the world or a leg up, like that's always something you could do. And then he said, well, right, but like they'd have to be qualified. Ooh. And I said, well, of course, see, that's a classic, isn't it? That's a subtle one. And I said, ooh, hold on, we got to stop right there and unpack that. Did you hear what you just said? Like, of course they would be like, no, and just that inkling, like, oh, well, that there might be some Black person who wasn't, and they should hire. And then we just got into that conversation. They realized it in that moment. I mean, we're best friends. There was no attacks or anything. It was just this like yucks. He felt yucks about it. He realized what he had said, what an ingrained thing. He does have some racist people in his family. And, again, that was sort of like a little course correction moment. And it made me really think about that because it was such a subtle one that is used often in that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was working with a very well-respected scientific group and giving a keynote. And before my keynote, the CEO was taking questions from employees. And one of the questions was, can we re-examine our diversity efforts because we want to make sure we're getting actual qualified candidates instead of hiring people just because they're Black?
Ugh, boo.
Yeah, exactly. Boo, 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 boo. So, yeah, that's a real common one. Where they don't feel the need to say, oh, let's hire some white people, but let's make sure they're qualified.
Yeah, no one has ever said that. No one has ever said that, that's the contrast that we see that I identified in that conversation immediately. Was like, you would never have said that about anyone else.
Nope. So, and again, this happens all the time. One way that a lot of people can understand it a little better is through the lens of benevolent sexism. Like, I feel like people can recognize that. Putting your hand on the woman's back to help her through a door, or calling her sweetie or babe, or even the things like, oh, don't swear, there's a woman present, or praising a woman for her note-taking abilities. That's benevolent sexism, and that's the kind of subtle racism also that comes up with people of color. That we think that because we're complimenting someone, because we're complimenting an Asian American on any trait related to a model minority, we think it's not racism anymore. It's racism if you're making an assumption based on race, period.
Yeah. I mean, I think this goes in line with like that classic comment of saying about a Black person, like, oh, they're so well spoken, right? That's just like the number one's been there forever. And it's tough because here's the thing, like, even if so for example, I don't care if it was a white person right now and I watched an interview with them and they were very well spoken, I would say that. I would go, wow, they were really well spoken. But I would catch myself if it were. And so in a way that's weird because there's certain things you can't almost compliment people on because they're just too entrenched in racist, situations. And then another thing, I'll admit a mistake I kept making. So even though I'm half Jewish, boy, I overused that word Nazi with everything. And boy, that became a backfiring situation. Again, maybe because it's so ingrained, or maybe because 4 or 5 years ago, it didn't seem to be that big of a thing. If I, for example, in my first book talking about thyroid doctors, and they often are very, they favor one particular hormone over others, and it doesn't make any sense. So I call them like the drug is called Synthroid, and I used to call them like Synthroid Nazis. Now, regretting it now, I never want to use that word again, but man, sometimes you have to catch yourself because it's so ingrained. You throw on these words and you don't realize. And then it became very obvious as of late, right? With all the anti-Semitism and things going on, and really people connecting things that shouldn't be to Nazi Germany. Yeah. And, I realized, ooh, I'm part of the problem here too. I got to stop saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to sort of take the terror out of that. Another thing that's sort of related to this is taking out the terror of that word racist. Where, there's people who truly believe that being called racist is as bad as being called the N-word. I'm not making that up. That's a statement that has been made multiple times by people.
That's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's gotta go. Like, we're all racist to some extent. Not to quote, what was the musical Avenue Q? we all of us have some of these racist assumptions left in our subconscious, and to that extent, the word is almost meaningless,
Yeah.
right? I mean, like, just take the power out of it. Either, don't you don't even have to use it if you don't want to. Um, but the systemic portion of it is the part that really is causing a problem. Yes, we can go individual by individual, and you can do this interior work for yourself to figure out, where are my biases? Where are these little creepy crawlies still living and thriving inside my subconscious? But in terms of actually making an impact, the impact has to be made at a systemic level with our policies and procedures and systems and politics. That's where we really can make a difference in terms of bettering people's lives.
I had a funny scenario where someone had emailed me, and I forget if it was during like the Black Lives Matter stuff going on or whatever it was. And someone had just brought up to me, well, here's the interesting thing. They assumed, because of what I look like, that I didn't know much about race, maybe didn't know much about Black authors or Black people. Like, you know what I mean? They assumed I might be ignorant in this arena, which I think is funny because that's sort of a form of racism in a way. Like, you know what I mean? It's like a little bit of a different. And it was funny because they were suggesting all these people. I'm like, yep, I've read all of Maya Angelou's books. They mentioned Elle Sharpton. I'm like, yep, I watch a show every week. And I think one of the things that I like to do is, and this is why I do appreciate watching Black journalists, and I do tune in, and I suggest that for people. You know what? Like, record Elle Sharpton's show every week. Like, just see what people's perspectives are. There's one thing I really love about Ari Melber's show. He often has a ton of people of color on there. Perhaps that's because he's a Jew. I'd like to think that, we do have a lot of skin in that game and always have. Not to say that Jews aren't racist, because like we said, everybody can be. So I appreciate that. And it was like me going down that rabbit hole with the Netflix series about the hair. And then also I was like, you know what, I'm on a roll. I watched the Harriet Tubman thing. I watched Loving. By the way, I love that movie, Loving, about the true story of that couple. Because when you watch things like this, you're hearing again these people's stories and their perspective. And I feel it's enriched my life. And so I continue to do it and specifically seek it out. Because, even as a podcaster, there's been times where you just go, oh my God, I'm interviewing a lot of white people, or like you just don't even realize. Now, granted, in the health space, unfortunately, there just aren't a lot of like health fitness experts, authors that are of color. But they're out there. And again, sure. I think it's just an attention for me. And so I literally went out seeking it, not to be congratulated for being so diverse or whatever, but because I noticed that it was just a thing. Not because I'm racist, just because they were all here, until I noticed, hold on a second, there's got to be more people in this arena. And I want to see what they have to say. So I feel like if we tune into people of color's perspectives, whether it be a radio show, a columnist, or something, that's probably a great place to start. You mentioned Black Panther, right? And briefly in another context, but my favorite line from that movie is when the Black guy turns to the Jewish guy and he says, hey, don't pretend like you don't have skin in this game. Just because he's white, right? But he also could be lynched for being a Jew. And that was the point there. But I think we all have skin in this game, because look at our society now. We are so multicultural, yet this has become such a big problem. So I laughed actually when I turned to the last section of your book, because I turned the page and at the top center, it says, in closing, good luck. And I just laughed because it almost seemed like you were like, good luck, motherfuckers. Like, good luck with this topic. I gave you all I could. And I just laughed out loud because that's the way I read it. But
I think that's a perfectly valid way to read that.
Yeah. So what in the closing minutes here, what haven't we discussed that can be brought up? What are some other ways we need to think about this? I think we've touched on some important points here. What are some other nuggets you can give us?
I think, so here's one thing I would let people think about. The first thing is that whites can't not benefit from white privilege, right? Like, white people have white privilege. It doesn't mean they haven't worked hard. It just means that, imagine how hard you've worked, and then imagine if you were Black and it would be harder. That's all that means.
True.
And no matter how much you want, you can't not benefit from it. Like,
right.
you're
You can't
going
take
to
it
get
away.
this
It's there.
right. It's there. It doesn't matter how liberal you are, how progressive you are. It doesn't matter how many black friends you have. Although, frankly, research shows us that for most, the average white person, out of 100 friends that they have, only one of them will be a black person. But it doesn't matter. You are still going to benefit from white privilege. So that for to my mind, you really need to be the one to help fix this.
Right. We have the obligation.
Yeah. Like, this is coming to you no matter what. It's like someone's just depositing money into your account every month and you can't stop it no matter what. And so therefore, if you really want to make things equal, you have to up those donations, right? And if you think of this in terms of the amount of effort that you need to put in, this racism is not going to be solved by people of color. In the end, it will have to be resolved by white people. Just like the people who most need to be talking about race are white people. Because the people who are most likely to be listened to by other white people are white people, especially white men. And when people of color talk about race, they are much more likely to be punished for it and have it become a black mark on their record in whatever situation that they're in. So, this is on you guys, and I hope that you see it more as a positive. Like, think of how much you can do and change, the impact you can make with less
it
effort.
is leaving the proper legacy for yourself. And also it is important, like you said, we're the only ones that can do it. So, okay. So aside from, like, let's say donating to the NAACP, what are some other organizations and things you've come across over the years that maybe we should look into and see, like, okay, well, because let's say I live in a very liberal, diverse area, and maybe there's nothing I can do technically in my community. What are some ways we can think about contributing, whether it's via money and donations to organizations or time? Can you give us some ideas there?
Yeah, I mean, number one, I would. A lot of people immediately say, "Well, shop at black businesses." I'd go a step further and say, make sure you're not shopping at white supremacist businesses.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Take a look. But when I say white supremacists, take a look at their board. Who are their executives? If the people who are making the profit off of this corporation are entirely white, and usually white males, but if it's an entirely white organization, or the only person of color they have is their DEI officer, I would not give them my money.
Okay, let me throw a devil's advocate out to you. It's like, well, hold on. Just because they're all white doesn't mean they're racist or white supremacist, or doesn't mean they're not doing good things on the side. So just address that objection.
Well, okay, that would mean that you'd have to believe that the reason that their board and their executives are all white is because those white people were that much better than every person of color who applied.
Right. Which we have to, like, laugh about that now.
Right. If that's what you truly believe, that the way that they got an entirely white leadership team and board was because the white people were better every time, then okay.
Yeah, and I guess we can look up minority and women-owned businesses and things like that. Although, you know what? A lot of those too, they have a token person in there.
Yep.
So I don't know how are we going to be able to judge this, Celeste? Whether it's a board full of tokens, or does it matter?
I mean, so for example, I worked at WNYC when I was hosting the national show, The Takeaway, and the public radio was one of those things that people feel safe donating to because they're on this good side, right? They're supposed to be really good. But the fact of the matter is that there's a great deal of both sexist abuse and racism that goes on in public radio. Now, they're working on it, and in many cases, they're honestly working on it. But for example, with WNYC, the board, when a lot of these allegations came forward of abuse and harassment, the board made absolutely no attempt to respond to listeners' complaints. We need those listeners who are donors and absolutely ready to complain if we took car talk off the air, but not ready to go and complain to the board if there was credible accusations of racism. We need you to have the same skin in the game and the same outrage over racist practices and sexist practices as you do over your favorite show not airing at the time that you want.
Right.
And you know what? It's great to go to marches. That is 100% awesome. But even more important is those little tiny things, like being the person to speak up when you hear a microaggression, and not waiting for the person of color to do it.
Can you just, can you roll through some microaggressions real quick, just to tip off people to these kind of things? We've already mentioned a few, but if you could just rattle off some that come to mind.
Well, number one is with people of color, and especially women of color, being interrupted. It happens so much, most people don't even know it anymore. Wow. You can be the one that stops and says, hey, I would really love to hear what, Marcia let her finish what she was saying. You can also speak up if someone else takes credit for something that was first mentioned or described by a person of color. Say, oh, yeah, so-and-so, Jerry said that. That was great. Maybe, Jerry, could you flesh out that idea a little bit more?
I love that.
So speak up that. There's obvious ones as well. I mean, the things like, talking to a Black person about basketball or dancing. That's obvious. But there are the more subtle ones, like saying, I don't think you're quite ready for leadership. Right? Speak up when those things happen. If yet another white male or white person is chosen in a leadership position, why don't you ask at the next meeting, hey, were there no candidates of color? Why is our leadership team all white? One of the problems that white people have, and this is not a criticism, it's just an actual fact, white people have trouble seeing whiteness.
Sure.
And don't seem to notice when a room is full of white people. So
absolutely. This was the problem I was having with the podcast. And so I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh. So with the former podcast I did. So we're blind to it. And this is probably why people are blind to the white privilege as well.
Yeah. And I need white people to start noticing and start asking questions.
I love it so much. This book is so great. Everyone needs this book. Really, honestly, you might not buy it for the racists in your family. I don't know that but some of the things in here are really important. So speaking of race, why everybody needs to talk about racism and how to do it, coming out November 2nd, please pre-order this book. I really feel like this is something I will refer back to again. I learned so much. I feel even more inspired as to what I can do. I feel more empowered. And
I'm so glad.
Yeah, this is just really wonderful. And then, of course, we'll put everything in the show notes to connect with you and your other books. But what would you like to leave our audience with on this topic? And also just so grateful that, by the way, did anyone say, like, what right do you have to write this book? Who are you? You're not really Black. Or have you ever had any kickback on it?
I have not. I mean, it helps that I'm the granddaughter of a very, very famous Black figure in history.
Sure.
So my credibility is in Wikipedia.
Hey, who knew? That's amazing.
Right. So, I mean, that helps. But the only thing I would like to say is that you don't have to be afraid of this. This doesn't have to be a exhausting it really doesn't. You can be funny about it as long as you're not insulting. You can own up to your own experiences and laugh about it. Like, this doesn't have to be the worst conversation you have all year, right? It can be empowering. It can make you feel good. It can make you feel enlightened. So, stop treating this as though it's, like the textbook on statistics that you avoided your entire time you were in college.
Right. And tell us, I mean, you do so many things as a journalist. Where can we, other than, following you on social media, where can we see you out and about? Tell us a little bit. Of course, we'll put this in your bio, but tell us a little bit about some of the other things you do other than being an author.
So I do a lot of keynotes, speeches. I am still a guest host for NPR. I host a number of podcasts. I host one for the National Gallery of Art, which gets well-known musicians to pick an artwork and then respond to it musically. That's a pretty cool one. I know. And a podcast for the Conferences for Women, which does these in-depth interviews with some really, really brilliant, mostly women and a few men. So the easiest thing to do is just go to my website, celesteheadlee.com, and I try to gather everything there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this writing endeavor. It's truly needed at this time, but in general, I feel like it's oddly enough a fun read, even though the topic seems a little dark. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate this. And I'm so grateful to sort of, put this forth through the audience and get us thinking about this.
Thanks. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. And everyone else, we'll see you soon. Hey listeners, over the years, a ton of companies have approached me to collaborate, but I will only promote companies whose products I believe in and that I actually use and consume on a regular basis. So let me tell you about some of my favorite companies that I can offer you discounts for. Rep Provisions, an amazing company doing incredible things for our planet, topsoil, and animals with regenerative agriculture, and it's my #1 source for quality pasture-raised meat and chicken. Visit repprovisions.com and use code L15 for 15% off. I'm also obsessed with a company called Carnivore Crisps. They make a lean, all-natural, and delicious alternative to conventional snacking, made with just real meat and real salt. Totally addictive, and my favorite ones are the beef brisket and the ribeye. Visit carnivorecrisps.com and use code PALEO10 for 10% off. I also love and regularly use Paleo Valley products. They make amazing supplements and delicious paleo products. I use the superfood greens powder, grass-fed beef sticks, the organ complex, and their bone broth bars. I love the lemon and apple. I also use their essential C complex and more. Visit paleovalley.com/promos/Elle Russ for 15% off. I also love Primal Kitchen. They make delicious paleo-approved, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and no refined sugar products, and I use them daily, from their collagen powders and sauces and marinades to their avocado and olive oil. So good, so healthy. Visit primalkitchen.com and use code L10 for 10% off. I also love paleo powder and use it almost on everything I cook. They make incredible seasoning blends, and they also have these incredible grain-free coatings that feel just like crispy breadings that you would have had prior to knowing that there's another way. So visit paleopowder.com and use code L15 for 15% off.